Our fourth speaker of the day, many of you who know her or do know her know that she's very passionate about her students and ensuring that receive a well-rounded university education. Dr. Janay Nugent is an alumna who has been teaching the Department of History and occasionally in Women's and Gender Study and Liberal Education for 17 years at the U of L. Her research on the history of children and youth in 17th century Scotland explores how young people coming of age in challenging historical contexts use their voices and actions to shape tumultuous worlds in which they lived. Historically, young people are consistently on the front lines of change, and in our rapidly evolving world, the opportunity to shape future directions of society, our communities, and one's own personal life awaits our students. In this talk, Janay will attribute her own University of Lethbridge liberal education with providing her with a voice and the tools to shape her future. And will encourage students to consider how their own liberal education can become a powerful tool of adaptability and a way to contribute to our rapidly evolving society. So Janay's last lecture topic is, this is our last talk before lunch, the empowerment of young people in tumultuous times. Do we have Janay ready to go?
Yes, I'm
Take it
here.
away.
Can you hear me?
And yes.
Okay, there we go. All right. I am speaking on the empowerment of young people in tumultuous times today. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I give this presentation on traditional Blackfoot land. This is Treaty 7 territory and the lands of the Métis Nation. The theme of my talk is youth empowerment. So I just want to briefly explain the images on your screens as I give this territorial acknowledgement. This is a painting by one of my students, Marty Healy. She has given me permission to show her gorgeous artwork that emerged from a class project in Women and Gender Studies on representations of parenthood that just finished up this last spring. I wish that I had the time to fully describe all of the really rich symbolism in this painting, but in a single sentence, the painting engages with the impact of patriarchy, colonialism, and residential schools in creating struggles and challenges unique to the present day parenting for Indigenous mothers. The theme of my talk today is youth empowerment, and Marty's voice here is powerful to change making in our society, especially as a young Indigenous mother. Thank you for sharing your experience and your voice with us, Marty. So as I thought about what I should talk about for the last lecture, I came to the conclusion that with only 15 minutes, I had to stick to a single message. The topic was then pretty much immediately clear to me, as it is probably the single most important message that I carry through in my research and in my teaching. And that is that I want youth to know how powerful their voice is. I'm a historian, and historically youth have been on the front lines of all of the major changes. They're on the front lines of the French Revolution. They're, the first to volunteer for war efforts, good or bad. But youth are always there on the front lines of what is happening. And I've recently been on a committee where a student was on the committee, and they reminded me that they felt like their voice maybe wasn't respected or wasn't shared. And it surprised me because to me, the voice of youth is often the most powerful voice in the room. They're our future. They're empowered. They're the ones invested in where we're going forward. And we live in a pretty rapidly changing, frankly, pretty crazy world at the moment. So I felt like this really needed to be my message for this last lecture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and one of the reasons why I think youth voices and youth empowerment is such an important voice in particular. I think this has a lot to do with growing up in Southern Alberta in the 80s. It very much shaped my voice that I felt like I needed to be heard. I remember female serving staff at coffee shops and restaurants more often than not were smacked on their backsides by the male patrons. My class had to fight to let girls into shop and power mechanics classes. A gay friend who came out when he was in his late teens moved away as his entire family and closest friends disowned him. And my friends and classmates from non-European backgrounds faced a never-ending cycle of cruel comments and ostracization, which my white privilege rarely noticed until many years later, once I'd been educated and I'd been able to reflect on it. But there are moments along the way when I began to realize that I have a voice and that using it was the only way to begin to improve the lives of those around me. And I'm going to tell you one kind of silly story, but it's one that's really stuck with me. In grade 10, I remember taking driver's education. So I used to be able to take driver's education and get 2 credits towards your high school diploma. Besides practical driving or practice driving, there's basic car maintenance as part of the components of the course. So you have to learn how to like change oil and, you know, change a flat tire, that sort of a thing. I remember being enraged by the end of each of these sessions as the teacher would do things like make the girls watch the tires being changed because we simply weren't strong enough to tighten up the lug nuts properly. Or when he described what to do with an overheating car, he said, "Boys, remember to only turn the cap a quarter of a turn to let the steam escape or you'll be badly burned. Girls, it's like taking a lid off a boiling pot without an oven mitt. You're going to get very badly burned." By the time it came to write a course evaluation at the end of the semester, I could no longer channel my polite, well-brought-up self, and I lit into him for 2 pages about how condescending, sexist, and offensive his teaching was. I, in turn, was condescending about his lack of understanding when it came to the capacity of the female brain and the capabilities of women outside the kitchen. I was terrified to go into the last class the next day, but I didn't want to undermine my message by hiding, so I showed up. I remember hoping that he wouldn't look at me. I was cringing, but I met his eye anyhow when he came into the class. To my surprise, he picked up my 2 pages of chastisement and read them to the class. He laughed the whole way through, and at the end he said, "Nugent, you spitfire. I take your point," and I didn't realize how that was coming off. I don't know if the girls in later classes ever got to change a tire, but at least I had made this teacher stop and think. And the guys in the class teased me, calling me Spitfire for a number of days. So my message even managed to reach beyond my intended audience to the boys who were raised to become these men of condescension and privilege. But most importantly, I went home a bit shaken by this exchange with an authority figure. It was scary, but my 15-year-old self was different. I had now an understanding that my voice can be heard and that it can be an agent for change. So when I graduated high school, I came to the University of Lethbridge. You can see the slide on the screen here. I was a history major, and this is one of my, a picture of the Blackadders, who were then the Undergrad History Society. Some of you may recognize a fresh-faced Kevin Magoo in the center there. I was taking the picture, so I inserted myself in the top left. It was a great time. It was a time of real awakening, a time when I started to put together all of the experiences that I'd had where I began to understand the power structures in society. I remember sitting in an anthropology of gender class and just having my mind blown and going, wow, there's like ways and of structural ways that this is embedded into our society. I remember sitting in on a Canadian political science class with Ed Webking, who contributed a piece of the writing to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and learning about human rights. And I grappled with complex intersectionalities of the power structures of class and gender in Chris Hosgood's Victorian popular culture class. So he's just stepped down as Dean of Health Sciences. This all led to my intense obsession with finding the voice of those who had largely disappeared from the historical record. I was a historian. The poor, the illiterate, women, young people, religious and racial minorities, and those outside heteronormative society. This led to me being very interested in women's history, and I went to the University of Guelph. And this was a real eye-opener for me because my supervisor, my master's supervisor, was this amazing woman, Elizabeth Ewan, whose work in Scottish women's history has been absolutely groundbreaking. And this was a big change for me. Half the graduate students were female in my undergrad degree, as you can see in this picture, other than noticing that perhaps denim was really popular in 1995, you'll see that, you know, about 70 to 80% of my classes were male. I think I went back through my undergrad transcripts, and I believe 5 of my 40 courses were taught by women. And so to come and have a female supervisor teaching me about women's history was really, really groundbreaking. I'm particularly interested in the early modern era, which is roughly the period from 1500 to 1800. And I don't want to give you a history lecture, but historians are all about context. So I'm going to give you a bit of a context about what was going on and what kind of shaped that time period. The global economy built on the backs of African slavery and the exploitation of indigenous and racialized people around the globe was beginning to emerge. This allowed for wealth to be shared beyond the church and the nobility. Governments were centralizing, and they relied on a centralized judicial system to enforce their will across nations. Christianity splintered from a single Roman Catholic Church to many different denominations. Civil wars, wars of religion between countries, and colonial wars were being fought in Europe and across the globe. Education slowly, very slowly, but it did begin to spread beyond the elite. Dramatic population growth led to shrinking resources, extreme inflation, high levels of under and unemployment, starvation, outbreaks of plague and smallpox happened to almost every generation, with statistics being as high as 30 to even 50%, depending on the time period and where you were at, of children dying by the age of 10. It was a harsh and rapidly changing world. But by studying youth in this context, and I just want to clarify that youth in this context was roughly the age of 12 till marriage, which was sort of 23 to 25 for women and 25 to 27 or 28 for men. They were always on the edge of change. And they were also very much involved in sort of asserting themselves in structures, in a society where the structures, the political structures, the religious structures, the legal structures left them completely disempowered. But yet they're able to adapt and to some extent shape their communities in the changing world. This painting illustrates youth agency. Oh, sorry, I haven't got there. Let me go to it. This painting illustrates youth agency. And at first you might think it's not a big deal. So let me give you a bit of background. The Reformed Church in Scotland occurred in 1560. So in 1560, the government of Scotland voted to adopt the Calvinist religion. Scotland had been Catholic for about a millennia. And the government now said it's illegal to be Catholic. You now have to be Calvinist. And this has really driven one of my questions. How do you change the religion of an entire nation? And so they had a lot of different ways of doing this. There's sort of formalized government structures. They had church courts, local moral courts that were tasked with peeping in the windows of each other's neighbors to make sure that they were practicing the proper religion. And as a Calvinist society, they believed that they were particularly favored by God. So everybody was to behave in a way that was godly. This painting suggests that people are not listening to that all the time. So this is a lowland wedding or maybe a village dance, which would have been an opportunity for sort of youth culture to emerge and for young people to emerge. So I'm going to just point out on this painting some of the things that are going on. Now, just to give you a bit of background, the church prescribed that weddings were supposed to have a very limited number of people. They were supposed to only have a dinner with no alcohol, no dancing, and they were to sing psalms in the praise of God. But weddings were a point of community celebration. This is very much a subsistence world where people worked from sunup to sundown just so that they could eat. Starvation, happened if harvests failed. There was no extra. It was a very tough life, and weddings were community celebrations where the couple's friends were able to come together and let off steam, and they were able to meet each other, and they were able to make acquaintances and relationships that they would bring with them into adulthood in communities where your neighbors were the difference between survival or not survival. And so these were really, really important events. And despite the church doing things like requiring people to put money down to ensure that they wouldn't, have too many people, or that they wouldn't drink, or there would be no pipers in Scotland. They would have no pipers or fiddlers at their weddings, and there would be no dancing. They basically youth would give that money over and they would invite whoever they wanted and they'd have a heck of a party. The church didn't know what to do about it because they thought that this was offensive to God, and they really wanted to quash it. So they'd take the money, and a lot of these people would end up before the church congregation the next week, having to repent in sackcloth before the congregation, showing that they had done wrong. So here's an example of a wedding and why perhaps the church, who is trying to create conformity, especially in a centralizing government system where they're trying to centralize government and do this in an orderly way, can show you different things. So here's somebody drunk on a horse running off into the dark. There's a young person here smoking a pipe. Of course, there's people dancing, which they always thought would lead to sex. They called it licentiousness. There's some sort of sexual caressing going on here. Boys are fighting. This woman is holding the head of somebody who's vomiting from too much alcohol. And the minister is sitting here surveying the whole scene in sort of despair, going, it's out of control. This is not going to favor well with God. And God can do things like send plagues and create harvest failures. But it was too important for the young people. They said, this is our lives. And the records that I look at are full of examples of young people who are enforcing their own cultural, what was important to them culturally, and things that were important to their lives. So these are the day-to-day sort of assertions of power of young people beyond those who are on, the edges of armies or the edges of revolutions like the French Revolution or the Haitian slave revolt. These are, it can happen in a big scale or it can happen on a day-to-day sort of a thing. Now, when I entered the history department in 2003, I began to get to teach on some of this material too. So this is a really important way of communicating these ideas and talking about youth empowerment. Just to highlight that was a while ago. I've been doing this for about 17 years. Those of you who know Chris Burton, his hair is a slightly different color now. Now, I want to talk about youth empowerment, but I don't want to be tone deaf. I don't want to suggest that this world isn't crazy, because it is. There's an awful lot going on, high employment rates, an uncertain global or economic future, really shifting sort of landscape of politics happening. COVID, obviously, all the changes that have happened in COVID and all the things that we're coping with on a day-to-day basis. And of course, the death of George Floyd in the States is obviously one of the major things that's happening right now as we speak. And this can be incredibly overwhelming. And that's completely understandable. I totally get that. And I'm not trying to suggest that you need to save the world while you're just trying to survive all of this, because that's not the case. But what I do want you to think about is that you might have more power than you think in a world where all of these huge historical circumstances are happening, and it might feel like you have no control. I think you have more than you think you do. And I really think that this is embedded deeply in your liberal education. So our liberal education requires us, our students, to take a breadth of courses, 12 courses across the social sciences, fine arts and humanities, and natural sciences. This gives you a breadth of perspective of understanding complex issues that we are facing. And this really provides you with the opportunity to be able to understand these complex problems and come up with complex and nuanced solutions to ideas. So really, I encourage you to reflect on your liberal education and let it guide you. This is very much my experience. This is what's guided me. I did an undergraduate degree at the University of Lethbridge, and I'm the product of that liberal education. And once you've kind of figured that out, another thing that I suggest is to figure out what motivates you and what makes you move forward with something that's achievable and that will make a difference to you. So you don't have to save the world, just do little things, one thing at a time. So I've got a couple of examples just to pull out for you. This image is of some of my students. So my current master's student who also did his undergrad at the U of L, and two other students, all their names are on the side here, who just graduated and they're all history students. Both the students who just graduated both have jobs already in COVID with a history degree. And so they took advantage of some of the opportunities of their education. These are applied studies, experiential learning that they've done, working on a project with me and with two of our alum, Matthew and Penny Stone, who are also history graduates at the University of Lethbridge. And we've been working for about 3 years to begin to develop resources to support our students so that they, in the social sciences and humanities, so that they can understand what their skill set are and how much in demand that it is in the workforce, and helping them translate that and market themselves into the world. So I just am going to throw this slide up really quickly. After meeting with a lot of business owners and business decision makers from multinational organizations to family-owned businesses, we asked them what employers are looking for in skills in the humanities, and then we talked to faculty and students about the skills that they think that they have. And on the left are the skills business leaders look for, and on the right are the skills that history faculty and students know they have. In the middle are they overlap. A lot of those things really overlap, and they make you incredibly valuable employees. So take advantage of your education. Really, don't shy away. I know online learning is going to be tough, but don't shy away from your education. Keep pursuing it because this is the thing that'll be able to help you sort of become employable and become good citizens as well. On the line of citizenship as a pillar of liberal education at the University of Lethbridge, think about the voice that you have as a young person. And I'm just gonna pick the example of Black and Indigenous Lives Matter. The rally in Lethbridge yesterday was amazing. This is a picture of the young people that I went with that I'm super proud of. I believe it was the first rally that they've all been to, but they learned pretty quickly what one voice put together with other voices can mean. So here's an image of the rally, and I just want you to hear one of the chants and listen to how many voices are here in Lethbridge working against racial inequality, racial oppression, structural oppression, and structural violence. So I just have a quick little clip. Matter! Black lives matter! Black lives matter! Black lives matter! Black lives. So there's many things you can do that might make you feel better, contributing in small ways, mow your neighbor's lawn. Sharon Spenceley just talked about the joke line, really the things that you can do to move forward, to make yourself feel better and to have a bit more control over your life is to think about what will move you and to use your voice to help others and to help yourself move forward in all of this sort of crazy world in which we're living. So I want to say thank you, and thank you to the PAC Club and to the undergrad University of Lethbridge Students Union for the invitation to speak.
Thank you very much for that, Janay. That was a wonderful lecture. I've been taking notes of things through all these lectures that have sort of hit home with me that I'm going, this is what I'm going to take from this. And I'm also an undergrad and did my graduate degree at the U of L as well and did this liberal education thing. So it was very, when you brought up your research and you said, how do you change the religion of an entire country? Right away, the light bulb started going in my head and going, this is what I loved about my liberal education at the U of L. I was just interested like crazy by history, religious studies, and anthropology and how those three things intersected. So that was just, to me, it's exhilarating to just sort of, my mind's already starting to fire those thoughts in all directions. I gotta have a coffee with you one day now to talk about it.
Excellent. I'm in.
And at the same time, I found myself drawn to the overall message of your talk about how to learn to utilize your voice with that liberal education and to not be quiet. And as you just pointed out, it's so important in the society we live in today, and continuing to move forward with that. I like that you related it to the sort of patriarchal society you had to tolerate as you went through shop and school. And I was just excellent lecture.
Thank you.
With that in mind, we do have some time for some questions now from the audience. We did get one that falls right in line with the end of your talk, from Robin Derry, who said, what do you think are some of the most important ways that youth can speak out and make their voices matter beyond just joining protests?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really it's about showing up, and it's about caring and being engaged, informing yourself, right? Watching what's going on in the news, having conversations with your friends, with your neighbors, participating in a protest if that's something that you care about and you want to see change for. If you have your own experiences to contribute, you know, contribute them either at a rally or maybe send something to an editor, write a blog. There's just so many different ways that you can do this. The painting that I showed at the beginning was from a student, and it was my representations of parenthood class. And one of the things that we practice is they do a research paper, and it can be on any aspect of parenting, and they sort of have to create a feminist understanding of parenting. And then the goal is that we will workshop that into a 5-minute presentation that's for a non-special audience, somebody who's never been in that class before. But it's really hard to take your ideas that you learn, all these complex ideas in classes that you spend 12 weeks learning, and then how do you share those in a succinct way that makes sense to people who haven't been in the class and non-specialist people? So usually what we do is everybody in the class has to bring 1 or 2 guests, and we have a public presentation day, and it's just an amazing day. And we bring in snacks and people present, and their friends and their family get to hear them. But COVID happened and we didn't get to do that this year. But it ended up being an incredibly powerful experience anyhow, because I asked them to share with the people they're sheltering with, or to email their presentations and their presentation can be in any form. It could be performance, it could be artwork, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, whatever they're comfortable with, a blog post, memes, whatever they wanted to do to get their ideas from the paper across. And it ended up sparking these amazing conversations, intergenerational conversations, between children and their parents about growing up as a first-generation Canadian, from a different culture, about things that parents had never heard or really ever thought of. And so it really started these conversations with their families and their friends. And so I think that these are things you can do. Take your education and just talk to people.
Yeah, I love that idea that you have them take that complicated focus thing and say, now deliver it. With my students, I'm always telling them, and I have to give Dr. Belinda Metz more credit for this, because she's the one who beat this into my head too, was, do it like you're presenting it to your grandma, who doesn't understand any of this.
Oh
And
yeah, that's great. I like that.
yeah, and then the 3-minute thesis, of course, I don't know how many of your students participate in that, but I find that I love attending that and watching that, because it's the same thing, right? Like one slide, talk for 3 minutes, the audience, get them to love it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an amazing thing for sure. So for the grad students, yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a bit about sort of when you were younger and ways that you sort of, I love I'm still not quite sure if your shop teacher actually acknowledged you at the end there. Are you sure if he acknowledged you, whether he was just sort of still being a smart aleck back to you? I'm not sure.
I don't know. And that's what I say. I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure how that happened, but he did. I mean, he recognized me. He didn't just shove it to the side. He brought it to the class and he read it, right? Like it was like, this is a student telling me off. But it is, I don't know why he would do it I mean, he did laugh. He kind of chuckled all the way through, but it was in the spirit of, oh, Nugent, you spitfire. Like I'd never realized that that's how this was coming across. And, whether or not he really changed, I don't know. But you just keep on trying, right? And it's 30 plus years later and I'm still trying, and this world is not an equal place, but that doesn't mean you give up. You just keep working on it.
Well, and that's again why I think your message of voice and empowerment is so important, especially when we consider, and again, working at university here this whole time, in every hiring committee we sit on, the importance of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Yep.
My wife was involved with YWCA as the president for a long period of time, and anybody who thinks the glass ceiling is gone is just they're not paying attention. So I think it's really important to do that.
No, that was part of my talk to be at one point, but I cut it out for time, which
I
was
think you
that
did a
I'm,
really good job.
30 plus years and I'm still seeing, women who aren't being hired because of deeply embedded gender biases and structures that are in place. And that becomes even more amplified for women of color. So, it's a complex world and these things have not been dealt with.
Yeah.
But
So
we are hopefully moving forward with awareness.
I think we're, it's people like you and again, liberally educated to the grad class, like you said, that's attending this and everyone else. It's to take that out and always keep that in mind at your forefront, right? It's important.
Yeah.
We do have
Yeah.
time for one more question, but if anybody in the audience has any more.
I was just going to say, can I just say one thing? Jim Tagg was very involved with the liberal education, and he was one of my undergrad
Me too.
instructors in history. You too? Yeah.
Me too, yeah.
And liberal education, he always said that an education is a responsibility. And, even though our government is moving towards society paying for less of that, they still substantially invest in our educations. And that's because they want not just us to succeed in terms of being economic contributors to society, but because they want us to bring our educated values to society and to make this a better place. So it's part of your responsibilities, I think.
Yeah, he was my history 1000 professor, and yeah, he lit a fire under me right away. He was very
Yeah.
inspired a lot of people, I think. So. Okay, we didn't get any more questions. So with that
Okay.
said, thank you very much, Janay, for your wonderful lecture.